Historians tell us that toward the end of the 15th century in Europe, most of the population seemed to be caught up in this feeling of deep despair. The hopelessness was such that, and the depression was so great that most people really thought the end of the world was coming very soon. In the year 1492, which may sound a little familiar to most of us, there was a German author who wrote a book, and he entitled it The Nuremberg Chronicle. And what he did was to collect all of the major calamities that had happened to humanity from the very beginning of history, right up until that present time. And of course, the litany of evil included the Black Plague, the bubonic plague that had devastated the whole population of Europe about 150 years earlier before he wrote. And then with a really depressing conclusion, the author even included blank pages at the back of the book so that any further catastrophes could be written down after people had read his work. It was just the very next year, in 1493, that there was this battered little ship that sailed into Lisbon harbor. It had come through a year of storms in the Atlantic, and at the wheel was a man who had a story that was almost too amazing to be true, because he spoke not about the end of the world, but about a whole new world of endless possibilities. Of course, his name was Christopher Columbus. And the point is that just when things looked at their worst, something happened, something changed all that despair and all that depression into hope and into joy. Now, some of that story surely applies to the situation that you and I are finding ourselves in as we battle the coronavirus in our midst. It's forcing us to live separately and live carefully. It's forcing us to have to watch and listen to me using this technology this morning rather than being together in our sanctuary. But you know what? As we look to a brighter day just over the horizon, and our hopes get renewed along with the advent of spring, which is now here, it always brings us a sense of new life, a sense of new optimism. Now, my point here is that that's precisely the kind of effect that Jesus of Nazareth had on our world. You know, we sometimes forget how incredibly popular Jesus was during the 3 years of his public ministry. Now, we shared in a scripture reading in the first video today, and that reading helps us to remember that this takes place at the home of Simon Peter, where Jesus has just healed Peter's mother-in-law. And the text of Mark's gospel tells us that evening at sundown, they brought to him all these people who were sick. The whole city was gathered around the front door of that house. And then a little later on, remember we read how in the next morning, and it was still very dark, Jesus got up, he goes out to this deserted place. He wants to be alone. He simply wants to pray there. And then Simon Peter and his companions, they come looking for him, and when they find him, they say, "Hey, Lord, everybody's looking for you." And it's true, you know. All people, all of us, all men and women everywhere search for Jesus Christ. Now, they may not know his name, and they may not use the same kind of religious symbols that you and I do. They may use words and worship that are very strange to our ears and eyes, but they're searching. They're searching for something that Christ offers. What is that something? Well, first of all, I think it's the way in which people want to know, the way in which people really want to believe that life makes sense. That there's an order to it, that it's not merely a chaotic existence. Near the end of World War II, it was becoming pretty obvious that the Germans were going to lose, and in the midst of that, they launched this counterattack in December of 1944. And that attack became known as the Battle of the Bulge. This was a very critical time for the Allied war effort, because if this German counteroffensive worked, the end of the war was going to be delayed for months, maybe even years. And you know what? It almost did succeed, and part of the reason that it almost did was some brilliant strategy that was thought up by the German High Command. You see, this is what they did a few days before the battle began. They parachuted some of their men behind our American lines. Now, these paratroopers, they didn't carry any weapons. They never even fired a shot. You see, their whole mission was to drive over the roads that American reinforcements would have to use, and their job was to change all the road signs so they pointed to the wrong towns, so they pointed in the wrong directions. And then when the battle was actually launched, American forces called out for help. A lot of that needed assistance never arrived, because there were whole battalions of relief troops that were lost. They were stumbling around trying to find their way across a countryside where all the signposts were pointing in the wrong direction. In the same way, you and I sometimes feel as though we're living in a time when a lot of our signposts have been pointing in the wrong direction, or maybe totally torn down. Moral signposts, ethical signposts, theological signposts, they're all very strange in the directions they point, and sometimes they appear to be completely missing. You and I are living in a time where things are happening so fast, the years go by so quickly, that many of us will end up feeling as though we don't really remember what we were created for in the first place. And that's why we turn to the figure of Jesus Christ. And we learn through him that you and I really are the sons and the daughters of God, that we're precious people, each one of us. Precious because for each one of us, Christ died. And this has a way of assuring us that life does make sense, that there is a purpose to it, there is a direction to it, there's a will behind it, even though we may not always be able to determine exactly what that will is. So people look to Jesus even if they don't know his name. Even if they don't know his gospel, still they look to him, even in ignorance, to fill that kind of hunger, to know that life really does make sense in the final analysis. Now, the second reason I think we look to Jesus to satisfy our beliefs is that we believe that through Jesus, God really can be experienced. Rollo May is an author that may sound a little familiar to some of you. In his classic work where he wrote about how we search for ourselves, he says this. He says, "It may sound surprising, but the chief problem of people is emptiness." And by that I mean not only that many people don't know what they want, they also don't have any clear idea even of what they feel. And it soon becomes evident that their underlying problem is that they have no definite experience of their wants or their desires. They feel swayed this way and that way with painful feelings of powerlessness because they feel empty. Somebody has said that inside each one of us there is this God-shaped void, a God-shaped empty space. And we need to have some kind of experience of God in order to fill it. It's not just enough for most of us to believe that God is out there somewhere. We need more than that. You've probably heard the story about the boy who was flying this kite, and the kite was up so high in the air that the clouds actually hid it from view. Somebody came along and asked the kid, "Hey, how do you know the kite's even up there?" And the boy said, "Because I can still feel it pulling on the string." We need to feel that kind of pull from time to time, don't we? It's one thing for us to be able to say, well, God is out there somewhere in the cosmos, somewhere in heaven, somewhere. But we also need to be able to say that part of God is in here, right here with us, all the time, every day. See, I believe there is this basic human emptiness that nothing else will fill, no matter what we try, or how hard we try it, or how long we try it. And I say that because I really believe that you and I are created with a spiritual composition. That's one of the components that we have. There's physical, there's mental, there's psychological, there's emotional, and yes, there is spiritual. And as long as that spiritual component remains unfulfilled, as long as it stays empty, unused, I think we're always going to be a little bit less than what we were created to be. It's no wonder the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Hey, Lord, everybody's looking for you." They were. And so are we. Whether we know it or not, whether we admit it or not. So first, we need to believe that ultimately life does make some kind of sense. Second, we need to believe that God can be experienced. And the final thing this morning is that we need to feel as though life can somehow be controlled, that can somehow be overcome, conquered maybe even. There's this great story about Dr. Faust and how he gambled with Satan for his very soul. There was an artist named Moritz Retsch. He painted a picture about this story back in the early part of the 1800s. And he put the contest on canvas. And what he did was to paint this picture of the story, and he put it in the form of a chess game. So there's this chessboard laid out on a table, and Faust is on one side of the board, Satan is on the other. Faust, he's only got a few pieces left now on the board. He's got a king, a knight, a couple pawns. And on his face is this look of blank despair. On the other side of the board sits Satan. He's now leering in anticipation of his triumphant victory. For many years, people looked at this picture as it hung in the hallway of a museum. And the agreement was that Faust's position was totally hopeless. It's checkmate. Game's over. Satan's won. Faust is doomed. But one day, so the story goes, into the museum comes this guy who's a chess master. It was a man named Paul Morphy, an American. An American who some people believe just may have been the best chess player that the world has ever produced. Morphy stood in attention, just staring at that picture on the wall for a long time. He was fascinated by the look of terrible despair on Faust's face. I mean, he was about to lose his very soul to this satanic prince of darkness across the table from him. But then Morphy, the chess master, began to look at the pieces on the board, not the faces of the players. No other visitors came and went through the museum, but Morphy just stood there and he was lost in contemplation. And then the silence of the hall was shattered. People were shocked and startled by Morphy's shout that rang throughout the whole building. He screamed out loud, "It's a lie! It's a lie! The king and the knight have one move left." The king and the knight have one move left. The Apostle Paul, in writing his letter to the Roman church, tells them and tells us that we can be more than victors, more than conquerors, more than winners, because there's always one move left on that board. No matter how much life seems to box us in, no matter how circumstances may seem to grind us down, our indomitable faith tells us there's always one more move. Nothing could ever separate us from the love of God, Paul says. Not life, not death, not anything. You and I need to hear that. We need to understand it. This is part of the good news of Christ's gospel. We need to hear that, especially when we feel as though we've come to the end of the rope, when we think maybe we can't hold on any longer. The word comes to us that says, hey, game isn't over yet. There's still one more move. Jesus' followers said, "Lord, everybody's looking for you." They were. Then, same as now, looking for a belief that life really does make some kind of sense. Searching for a belief that God can be experienced and that that experience is good, really good. Searching for a belief that with God we can be in control, and most important of all, we can be victors. We can be conquerors. We can be winners. Let us hear and believe the words of this message today, for they come to us really from the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news that's meant for you and for me. Let us take these words with us as we live through the rest of this day and in the days yet to come. Thank you for listening. And we will do more of this as time passes, as you and I deal with the coronavirus emergency that has set itself firmly upon us. Thank you for listening. Goodbye, good day on this 5th Sunday in the season of Lent.